hemoglobin based on their protein structure. We're going to explain hemoglobin electrophoresis by filling out this chart over here. The way it works is that we have a gel that appears rectangular like this, and the gel has a negative cathode at one side and a positive anode at the other side, and there's a whole electron gradient that fills this gel. You're going to start by depositing your collection of hemoglobin at the negative cathode, and you're going to allow the hemoglobin to travel towards the anode. And this is possible because hemoglobin is a protein and overall has a net negative charge. And as we know, negatively charged molecules will go towards a positive source, or a positive electrode in this case. So let's start by taking the first and most simple genotype we can examine, which is hemoglobin AA. This is the normal hemoglobin that most human beings have. This is going to work as our control. And the way this works is it's going to travel all the way to the anode, from the cathode all the way to the anode at the end, and it's going to form one thick band over here. And we're going to explain quickly why this is a thick band. Because this is our control, we can label this as the spot for the A allele. So we can label this as A. Well, let's take the next pathology now. What if someone has hemoglobin SS? In other words, they are homozygous for the hemoglobin S allele. Well, what disorder do we call this? That's right, sickle cell disease. And can you recall the specific structural difference between the hemoglobin S and hemoglobin A molecule? Right, we have a missense point mutation that causes a single amino acid replacement in the beta chain. And that replacement is from glutamic acid to valine. And one last question, what is the net charge on glutamic acid versus what's the net charge on valine? Well, if you review your biochemistry and your amino acid structure, then you'll know that glutamic acid has a net negative charge and valine is considered a neutral amino acid. So bear with me, this is all going to make sense in just a second. Hemoglobin A has a glutamic acid. Hemoglobin S replaces that glutamic acid with valine. There's no other difference in the amino acid layout of the alleles. So therefore, hemoglobin S is overall more positive than hemoglobin A, because it replaces that negative glutamic acid with a neutral valine. So you can predict that because hemoglobin S is more positive compared to hemoglobin A, it's not going to travel as far towards the anode. So you can expect that, let's say you start hemoglobin S out here all the way on the left towards the negative cathode, it'll end up probably somewhere around right here, further away from the positive anode than hemoglobin A. And we can label this as S, and again, this is a thick band. So now let's explain this thick band versus, thin bands. So let's say that you have hemoglobin AS. In other words, our patient here is going to be heterozygote for hemoglobin S, and their other allele is going to be hemoglobin A. So how do you clinically classify this person? Sickle cell trait. So the electrophoresis is going to split now. One of the alleles is going to stop at S, and the other allele is going to stop at A. And this is why you have thin bands over here. A thin band represents just one allele, whereas a thick band represents two alleles. Another way to say that is the thin band represents that the patient is heterozygote, whereas the thick band represents the patient is homozygote for that allele. So this discussion on sickle cell disease and sickle cell trait is not only very highly tested because it integrates physiology, pathology, and biochem, but it's one of the many reasons that biochemistry and even just basic chemistry principles are very important to medicine. So make sure you review your sickle cell disease in the pathology section of this chapter, and not only that, but also review about amino acid structure and protein structure in the biochemistry chapter. So moving on, let's take another genotype, which is hemoglobin CC. Well, how do we classify this patient clinically? Well, this is simply known as hemoglobin C disease. And do you happen to know the amino acid change in this disorder? Right, glutamic acid to lysine. And again, glutamic acid has a net negative charge. Do you know what the charge of lysine is? That's right, it's net positive. So overall, hemoglobin C is more positive than both hemoglobin S and hemoglobin A. This is because hemoglobin S has a neutral valine in that place and hemoglobin A has a negative glutamic acid. And so you could expect that on electrophoresis, as the hemoglobin C is deposited at the cathode, it's going to want to travel even less towards the positive anode. And so it's going to deposit somewhere around right here. And we can label that as C. And again, you would expect it to be a thick band because the patient is homozygous. And then you can also predict that if someone has hemoglobin AC, then they would have one thin band at C and one thin band at A. And the same could be said with hemoglobin SC. They would have one thin band at S and one thin band at C. Let's end our conversation with the last variation, which is hemoglobin F, and this is fetal hemoglobin. Well, fetal hemoglobin is actually heterozygous. It has both A and F. The F allele is more positive than A, and it's more negative than S. So it ends up somewhere right in the middle, and so you're going to have one allele, one thin band right here, and then one thin band right here. And you can label right between A and S, F. So going from furthest migration to shortest migration, we have hemoglobin A, then hemoglobin F, then hemoglobin S, then hemoglobin C. And you can remember this by the mnemonic, a fat Santa Claus can't go far. Well, that's really all we have to say about hemoglobin electrophoresis. This is, it might seem like a very niche topic, but it's actually very, very relevant because it can sneak up in your pathology questions. And they can actually twist your pathology questions and turn it into a biochem question. So make sure you review this chart and not just